like to begin my talk by thinking about language, the processes that are involved in sentence comprehension. Okay, so imagine you are comprehending a sentence, like I went to the library to borrow a book. You need to, at the minimum, identify each word in the sentence, retrieve lexical representations of these words, and integrate the incoming word meaning into the sentence context. And you probably need to do more. And importantly, you need to do all these very quickly to catch up with the pace of the speaker, right? Because speakers can't easily produce several words per second. But A1 speakers usually have no difficulty doing this with the same speed as the speaker. And one way that seems to aid that processing is by predicting upcoming information during sentence comprehension. So imagine the same sentence context. I went to the library to borrow a. While listening to the sentence, you might already predict the word book based on the context and pre-activate representations associated with that word book. And this kind of prediction likely facilitates comprehension because people do not need to engage in a full bottom-up lexical activation process when the predicted input comes up. We know that predictable words are more likely to be skipped or read faster than unpredictable words, which we can take as evidence that prediction facilitates comprehension. But when we think about L2 processing, it's not that easy. Right? L2 comprehension is more difficult or less efficient compared to L1 comprehension. So my research largely focused on whether we can make L2 comprehension more L1-like, more efficient like L1 processing. So as I say, we know that prediction likely facilitates comprehension, and it can do so in L2 as well. But we also know that L2 speakers often predict more slowly or predict less detailed information than L1 speakers. So we might imagine a link like this that is less efficient online comprehension in L2 contributes to slower or less detailed prediction in L2, or slower or less detailed prediction in L2 contributes to less efficient online comprehension in L2. But if reduced prediction contributes to less efficient comprehension, maybe we can kind of reverse this and facilitate comprehension by enhancing prediction. And I'll come back to this question towards the end of this talk. But first, I'd like to think about why prediction might be reduced in L2. And in this talk, I'd like to consider two possibilities. The first possibility is that online processing of L2 specific features is difficult. So for example, if an L2 grammatical rule does not exist in L1, L2 speakers may not be able to apply the same rule that exists in L1. The second account we want to consider is that prediction requires cognitive resources. And because L2 processing is more cognitively demanding than L1 processing, maybe L2 speakers have fewer cognitive resources available for prediction during L2 processing. So I'd like to first look at the first account and look at online processing of L2 specific features. In this talk, I'm going to look at two types of L2 specific features. The first one is representation or grammatical rule that differs between L1 and L2. So for example, in English, you can say to wear a shirt or to wear earrings. Right? But in Vietnamese, you need to use different verbs depending on whether you wear a shirt or earrings. Right? So in this case, the verb wear have different representations in English and Vietnamese. The other feature I'd like to consider is representation or grammatical rule that does not exist in L1. Okay, so for example, grammatical gender marking exists in German but not in English, or classifier systems exist in Vietnamese and not in English. Okay. So I'd like to focus on the example of Vietnamese and German because those are the languages that we focused on in our experiment. So the first constraint that we use is verb constraints that I just explained in the previous slide. Right? These can be different between Vietnamese and German. So in German, we can use the same verb tragen to mean to wear a shirt or to wear earrings. But in Vietnamese, we need different verbs. Right? And classifiers exist in Vietnamese, but not in German. Right? So we can also focus on how German-Vietnamese bilinguals process classifiers during Vietnamese processing. Okay. So we looked at whether Vietnamese German bilinguals can predict the upcoming object based on verb constraints and classifier constraints. So a participant had sentences like this. So my wears one classifier shirt. And in this condition, the verb wear is only compatible with the shirt. So the participant should be able to use this verb to predict the shirt in this case, right? But if they also speak German, or if they're actually more dominant in German, they might translate this translate this verb to German, and they may temporarily be distracted by earrings, because earrings you can say or earrings using the verb try again. Okay. In the other condition, we use different types of sentences where the target object shirt was predictable based on the classifier. So in this case, the verb dry is compatible with both the shirt and dress here. But the classifier is only compatible with the shirt. So you can use the classifier constraints to predict shirt in this case. But if German Vietnamese bilinguals try to translate this classifier into German, the equivalent is not available. So we might find a delay in bilinguals looks to the predictable object, in this case, shirt. Okay. So in this experiment, we focused on heritage speakers, so heritage speakers of Vietnamese in Germany. Heritage speakers are unbalanced bilinguals who started learning the heritage language early at home and later became dominant in the language spoken in the society. Okay. So why look at prediction in heritage speakers? This is a nice group for us to look at because we can test an effective language dominance while controlling for the age of acquisition by recruiting Vietnamese A2 speakers, A1 speakers and Vietnamese heritage speakers who also started learning Vietnamese at very early on. Also, heritage speakers show non-native-like production and comprehension. So as psycholinguists, we also want to understand where they differ from A1 speakers. So in this study, we asked whether German dominant heritage speakers of Vietnamese use Vietnamese-specific verb and classifier constraints for prediction, like A1 speakers of Vietnamese. So let's first look at the data for verb-based prediction. Okay, so we're looking at time course graph showing the time relative to the sentence onset on the x-axis and the fixation proportion, so the likelihood of you looking at the shirt and earring among these other objects on the y-axis. Okay, and we're looking at the A1 Vietnamese speakers data on the top and the heritage speakers data on the bottom. Okay, so in this case, the verb was a key word that allows you to predict the target word. So the verb onset is kind of highlighted there. And we can see that the red line showing the looks to the target, in this case shirt, and the green line that shows the looks to the earrings or competitor, start to diverge before the object onset, which is a point 4,000 on the graph in the A1 Vietnamese speakers. Okay, so the dot on the graph, so it's here, shows the mean point where the red line and the green line started to diverge. Right? And this divergence point occurred well before the object onset. So this point suggests that A1 Vietnamese speakers use the verb constraints to predict the target object. Okay. But when we look at the same data plotted for heritage speakers, we see delayed predictive looks to the target. So heritage speakers show delay showing biased looks to the target compared to the accomplished object earrings. So suggesting that they were temporarily distracted by the earrings. Okay, so that was a verb-based prediction. Let's now move on and look at classifier-based prediction. So in this condition, the verb wasn't helpful for you to predict the target, but classifier was. Right. So we can focus on the window from the classifier onset and object onset in this condition. And we actually do find similarly early predictive looks to the target. So A1 Vietnamese speakers and the heritage speakers were similarly fast to direct their looks to the predictive object shirt over the accomplished object dress. Okay. So to summarize, we found that heritage speakers used classifiers that are absent in German for prediction similarly quickly as L1 Vietnamese speakers, but showed difficulty using verbs that were different from German for prediction. Okay. So we think that this might be due to transfer from a dominant language because the heritage speakers were more dominant in German. Right? So the transfer from German may interfere with prediction. So what might be happening in this experiment is when participants hear my words, they might translate or co-activate the translation equivalent verb tragen in German, and then they may look at objects that are compatible with the German translation equivalent of the verb. Okay. So coming back to the two possible accounts for why prediction is reduced in L2, we looked at evidence for the first one, and the as to why prediction might be reduced in L2 might be due to interference from dominant language. Okay, now we'd like to move on to the second question, whether reduced prediction in L2 is due to cognitive resource limitation. So we asked whether cognitive resources are required for prediction, both in L1 and L2 processing. So to do that, we looked at effects of cognitive load. Okay, so we constructed sentence pairs like these: the lady will fold the scarf, or the lady will find the scarf, and showed participants a scene like this. Right? And the target object scarf is plotted on the top right. And in the fold condition, in the predictable condition, the scarf was the only object that you can fold, right? And in the find condition or unpredictable condition, you can find anything in the picture, right? So the verb didn't allow you to predict the target object in that condition. Okay. And we created two conditions to manipulate cognitive load: no-memory load condition and with memory load condition. And this was a between subject variable. So in the no-memory load condition, participants just heard one of these sentences while looking at the scene, and we looked at whether we find predictive improvements to the target object. Okay. And with memory load condition, we asked participants to memorize 5 abstract words before they do this task. So the task that they did was the same, right? But before they do that, we asked them to remember 5 abstract words and then asked them to recall these words after they listen to the sentence. Okay. So this manipulation allows us to look at whether prediction requires resources, because if it does, we expect prediction to be reduced in the with memory load condition. But if prediction doesn't require any cognitive resources, this extra task should do nothing to prediction. So we expect a similar performance in the no memory load condition and with memory load condition. Okay, so it's a goal we found. So in the no memory load condition, we are again looking at time course graph to the target object scarf in the predictable and unpredictable conditions. Okay, so predictable condition is shown in the red line, and the unpredictable condition is the blue line. Okay. So we can see that L1 speakers and L2 speakers both showed a very similar pattern. Right? And we can see that the red line and blue line started to diverge well before the target word onset, which is 0 on the graph. Right? So in this condition, L1 and L2 speakers both use the verb constraints to predict the target object. Now moving on to the with memory load condition. So we now see a very different pattern from the no memory load condition, right? So we still do find some difference between the red and blue lines, but they started to be different much later compared to no memory load condition. So these results suggest that the prediction does require cognitive resources in both in L1 and L2. So to summarize, we think that the prediction requires cognitive resources. So prediction is more likely to occur when there are enough resources available, right? And we know that the cognitive resources are more limited during L2 processing compared to L1 processing. So L2 speakers may predict to a lesser extent than L1 speakers because they have fewer resources available for prediction during comprehension. Hey, so we looked at the second account and found evidence that prediction does require cognitive resources. Okay, now I'd like to present the final study looking at whether enhanced prediction can facilitate L2 comprehension. Okay, so this follows from the previous study. That is, if reduced prediction in L2 is due to limitation in resources, right? L2 speakers may predict more if they devote more resources to prediction. Right? And we know that L1 speakers' prediction actually can be enhanced in that way by simply instruct them to try and predict. Okay. So we want to ask whether we can do so in L2 and whether enhancing prediction is actually helpful for comprehension in L2. So in the last study I'm going to present, I asked whether enhanced prediction facilitates L2 comprehension. I'd like to present two competing possibilities to this question. And one is, yes, it does, because predictable input is easier to process, as I said at the beginning of the talk. Right. So if you remember, while listening to the sentence context, like I went to the library to borrow a, and if you can predict the word book before you actually hear it, then you already have had access to the information about the book. Right. So that might facilitate processing of the word book when the word book actually comes up in the context. Right. Well, we can also predict the opposite. That is, no, it doesn't facilitate comprehension because if you devote more resources to prediction, it leaves fewer resources for comprehension, assuming that the prediction and comprehension are different processes. Right. So if we can probably imagine something like this. That is, by default, you might, let's say, devote 60% of your resources to comprehension and 40% to prediction. This is just a very simplified figure. So this is not really what I want to, this is not what I really mean, but just to give you the ideas about this account. Okay. So assume you usually spend 60% of your resources to comprehension, but if you try to predict more, you'd need to use more resources to prediction, right? And because prediction is not automatic and does require resources, as we've seen, that might then the resources that you can use for comprehension might be limited as a result. Okay. So these are the possibilities as to whether enhanced prediction may or may not facilitate L2 comprehension. Okay. Right. So in this study, what we did is kind of similar to what we already see. So participants had either predictive or non-predictive sentences, like the woman who is wearing a hat will read one of the newspapers, which is a predictive condition because in the depicted object, you can only read newspapers. The other verb buy was in unpredictable condition because you can buy anything presented here. Okay. Right, that's what I said. So I expected that if you can predict the target word object, we expected that the participants will look at the target upon hearing the verb and before the newspapers are mentioned in the sentence. So we gave participants two kinds of tasks, the comprehension task and prediction task, and this was manipulated within subjects. Right. So in the comprehension task, participants they got the instructions. Okay, please click on the object that was mentioned in your sentence as quickly as possible. Okay, so participants just listened to the sentence and clicked on, in this case, newspapers. Okay. And in the prediction task, we additionally asked participants to try to predict how the sentence is likely to continue and then click on the object that's mentioned. Okay, so participants did the same task, but after the comprehension, we asked the participants whether their prediction was correct. And this was just done just to remind the participants that the task is to predict and not really to measure the correct accuracy of the prediction. Okay. Okay, so let's look at what we found. So we're now looking at the data from the comprehension task. So this is when participants are just asked to comprehend the sentences. Okay. And we're looking at the looks to the target in the predictable and unpredictable conditions. And as in the previous graphs, we see the dot, in this case around 700 milliseconds before the target word onset, showing when the red line and gray line started to diverge. Right. So in this condition, we can see that participants started looking at the newspapers more quickly when they got the predictive verb compared to when they got the unpredictable verb. Okay. Okay, now what happened in the prediction task? We find slightly earlier divergence point in the prediction task. So when they were asked to predict, they started looking at the predictable target faster compared to when they got the comprehension task. Okay. So this point was earlier in the prediction task than in the comprehension task. But we also noticed that the variability in the comprehension task was much larger compared to the prediction task. Right? So we wondered why this might be the case and looked at the task order effect because the half the participants got the comprehension task first and half the participants got the prediction task first. So we divided the participants into the by task order. So on the left-hand side, we are looking at participants who got the comprehension task first. And on the right-hand side, we got the participants who got the prediction task first. Okay. And here, interestingly, we see that prediction was indeed enhanced. So it became quicker when they got prediction task in the second block. Okay. But if they first got prediction and then the comprehension task, there was no difference in the speed of prediction. Right. So we found that the prediction was enhanced only if participants got the comprehension task. And this could be because of the carryover effect in participants who got the prediction task. That is, in the later comprehension task, maybe they kept predicting, and maybe the facilitation effect continued in that block. So finally, if we look at their response, so we measured how quickly they moved their mouse to the target object. And here we see both the main effects of the task and the predictable condition, but no three-way interaction. So we find that participants are faster to move their mouse to the target object when they were asked to predict them than when they were just asked to comprehend. And they were much faster to do so in the predictable condition than in the unpredictable condition as well. So to summarize, we find that instructing L2 speakers to predict can enhance prediction. So this suggests that prediction is controllable and not automatic process. And in L1, just like it is in L1, in L2, just like it is in L1. And we find that enhanced prediction may facilitate comprehension efficiency, looking at the mouse reaction time, but this still needs further investigation. Right. And so that's right. Sorry. So to just give you the take-home message, so we've seen that L2 speakers often do not predict like L1 speakers, and we looked at two possible accounts. That is, processing of L2 specific features is difficult, and the second, fewer cognitive resources are available for prediction during L2 comprehension. Right. And the final study suggested that enhancing prediction may be helpful for L2 processing. So at the beginning, I proposed that we might actually have a link like this in L2 processing that is less efficient online comprehension in L2 may contribute to slower or less detailed comprehension, detailed prediction in L2, and slower or less detailed prediction in L2 might lead to less efficient online comprehension in L2. Right. But maybe we can change this and reverse this reverse this and change this to a link like this that is the right-hand side. The enhanced prediction in L2 might lead to more efficient online comprehension in L2, and that might in turn lead to enhanced prediction in L2. But I'd like to follow up this in the future study as well. So thank you very much for listening, and I also like to thank all my collaborators and research assistants who helped me with these studies. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ito. Thank you for the wonderful talk. We are open for questions. The audience can ask any questions if they have.
Thank you, Aine, for a very good overview of your research, which I'm aware of since a very long time with Martin and Pia. I always have wondered, I did some work with prediction with illiteracy, but I have always wondered that prediction has to do with real world knowledge, first and foremost, like what people normally know about the world and objects, and not so much about language as such, because prediction has to do with semantics and pragmatics and stuff like that. So when we test in a laboratory situation, like we present pictures and we ask people to comprehend a piece of spoken sentence and look somewhere and we track them, there's some sort of obviously a compromise between what they otherwise may know and what they seem to know at this point in time. So but I agree with the processing account that processing does influence to the extent, you can say general cognitive ability of any person influences prediction as well, because it is a very vital cognitive manifestation of where someone anticipatory looks and what someone, how someone wants to make use of that piece of knowledge and speak it out. Or so these are some of the things that I always think before while designing any other study. But your track is consistent with earlier work that clearly shows that L2 speakers are at a loss. Proficiency might be playing a role there. So would you say it is a general cognitive processing problem or a language problem, or proficiency in that language constraints prediction? Or somebody just can be as predictive and anticipating everything if the real world knowledge ability is so good, but not so much the language that he wants to process that information. So
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. I think both can play a role at the same time, similarly. And I think one of the studies that I presented here, let me quickly go back to the slide I showed you. So this was showed for the heritage speakers data who speak Vietnamese and German, right? And here, for example, we can, for example, ask whether their prediction was whether their prediction was right compared to everyone Vietnamese speakers because of knowledge program or knowledge versus proficiency program or resource limitation program think. But in this case, for example, they were slower than A1 Vietnamese speakers, but they did eventually predict before the object was mentioned. Right? So this seems to be compatible with that processing account that it's not that they couldn't predict, but rather their prediction was slower compared to everyone Vietnamese speakers. Right? So in this case, I think, although we don't have any offline data suggesting that they knew these verb constraints, but their movement behavior seemed to suggest that they knew the constraints. That is, they know that this verb is compatible with the shirt, but not with earrings, and eventually used that for prediction, but was not as efficient as everyone Vietnamese speakers to do so.
Thank you. There are two other questions. You may go ahead.
So which one of us do you choose?
Ma'am, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you for this interesting talk. I want to follow up on Ramesh's question about the cognitive resources. You used verbal cognitive resource. What your cognitive load was verbal, and it could be the case that when in prediction you need your verbal memory to predict, right? So as Ramesh asked, is it a general cognitive load? Like if they had something else that wasn't verbal, if they had to do some kind of spatial task while they were doing it, or do you think you would get the same results?
Yeah, that would be a very interesting question. I can only speculate because I haven't done that study version with non-verbal cognitive load, but I think that would be a very interesting follow-up. I think that still does interfere with prediction, but as I said, there's no data that I can present here. So, yeah. But yeah, I think the prediction would be that if prediction does require general cognitive resources, we expect similar or at least some interference based on the non-verbal cognitive load as well.
So it's not specifically verbal.
Right.
Okay, we have another question. Utkarsh, can you, yeah.
Thank you, sir. Ma'am, I just wanted to ask you that you use a visual word paradigm. So mm, what was the main factor for choosing this paradigm instead of a sentence paradigm?
Right. Are you asking for any specific study or like in general?
In general, word prediction studies.
Hey, I also have used other paradigm. I just decided to stick to the visual order paradigm to present in this talk because of limited time. But I have also used ERP to look at prediction, and that is especially helpful if you want to focus on different, say, types of prediction, like whether we want to look at, for example, to what extent is predicted information easier to process, or what do you need to do when your prediction is disconfirmed, for example. I think ERP, for example, is good at dissociating these kind of processes related to prediction. But in these studies, I think eye tracking also has its own advantage. For example, if we want to look at how quickly people look at the predicted target, I think eye movements are quite very good measure because we can look at something like the divergence point that I showed in the talk.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ito, for the wonderful talk.